Hi, everybody. Today is a little bit of a chat about the importance of knowing about the history, a little bit of the history of economics, and also a little bit of history about medicine. And I'm of the firm opinion that you cannot. Um, just got to check my stream here. Sorry, guys. Hopefully the quality is coming through okay. So I'm of the opinion that you can't really treat people effectively in health unless you know a little bit about some of those things. And I think I'm in a position to say that because I certainly didn't know about those things until fairly recently, only a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And I look back on the things that I advised patients about quite a while ago, and without having that extra knowledge, I basically didn't advise people fairly well, or I made decisions about care which could have been a lot better. So the two books I think that have had some of the most profound effects on how I look at the treatment of patients are, one of the books is by a fellow called G. Edward Griffin, called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And there's another important book by a fellow called John Perkins, and he wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And um, those two books basically, I'll just give you a little bit of a background on them, and you can listen to both of those guys talk and discuss their books to get an idea of what they're talking about. So the Creature from Jekyll Island, essentially, Jekyll Island is a little island off the coast of Connecticut, and a very important meeting took place there at the beginning of the last century. And the meeting was responsible for changing the whole basis of the financial system in America. And prior to that, the Americans didn't really have a central bank in place, and the central bank was trying to get in place for a long time. And people don't realize, but the central bank is owned by private families. And as part of that meeting on Jekyll Island, one of the things that a group of people, some of the richest people in the world, came up with was to legitimize the sound of the central bank. And this is why they came up with the name the Federal Reserve, because it does sound like it's almost an organizational thing to do with the government, and it's not. It's a private company. And the next step was to ensure that a private company could lend money to the government, charge government interest, and then get huge repayments and essentially get a country into debt. And this is what we see in America now. And again, as explained in that book, which is very important, but we have this idea of these central banks forming economic policies to try and help countries out and to try and keep countries stable. And in fact, that's not really what happens. What does happen is that busts are built into the economic cycle. And we know that people with ulterior motives engineer these busts, because we have records which are open to public scrutiny that show some of the richest and wealthiest people in the world selling all their stocks and shares before a massive plunge in the market. And then these guys come back in and pick up these shares at massive discounts, sometimes 90%. The shares go back up and they make absolutely immense profits to that essentially mean that money, the whole concept of money is almost irrelevant, because we're talking about multi-billions and trillions. So essentially what happens when we have these busts is the banks knock on the government's door and they say, we need our money back, or we need a payment on our debts. And where that payment comes from is, it essentially comes from the middle class and the very rich. People probably like myself and most of the general population are irrelevant. We don't kind of own enough assets for these guys to care about. And essentially any massive thing like the Great Depression, and we had a big dip in 1930, we had the financial crisis, the housing crash, all these essentially meant the reallocation of wealth and assets from the middle class and the rich into the hands of the super rich. And we're seeing the same thing happen again with the disastrous economic effects with lockdown. So we have all these medium to small businesses which have been around for sometimes hundreds of years, family businesses that are now bankrupt. And essentially we have these massive corporations that can now come along and pick up these building businesses and lands and areas and whatnot at a fraction of the cost that they once were. We have this kind of exodus from cities with all these lockdowns because hotels are empty and businesses are empty. So we have the most valuable land in the world. The price of that will crash. And again, we have these massive entities that just end up picking up bargain basement prices. I'm going to get back to why that relates to health in a little while. So the book from Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, describes Perkins' journey as, I guess, a negotiator and a middleman between the central banks and developing countries. And he ended up leaving that because he just couldn't cope with the destruction that he had a hand in causing. And essentially what his job was to negotiate getting the central banks into these countries. And at the beginning, as he describes it, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, so I hope I get it right, he describes going into these countries and believing kind of what he was telling the governments of these countries, which were that the central banks would essentially put in vital infrastructure which would benefit the countries. So in other words, they'd build bridges and schools and tunnels and hospitals and all these so-called important things. And the central banks would lend these countries the money and have all this amazing infrastructure in place. But quite often, the leaders of some of these countries would look at the whole deal and go, hang on a second, all we're doing is we are getting ourselves into massive loads of debt. This is just a kind of slavery. We're not interested in the deal. Thank you very much. We have our resources and we're confident that we can actually become a successful country. And then Perkins describes what he calls as the jackals who sit around in the background. And Perkins' job was to tell these politicians or presidents or the important people in the country that if you don't accept the deal, the jackals will be approached, and the jackals basically have no morals and will jump at the deal and will just take all this money and end up compromising the values and the kind of integrity of the country. So the leaders who were trying to have the best interests of the country at heart were left in a very difficult position where they accepted an absolutely rotten deal, but at least they could have some hand in trying to sway the direction of the country in somewhat of a positive direction, or leave people with absolutely no morals take the countries in a horrible direction of almost dictatorship. And Mugabe's role in Nigeria might be a perfect example of that. Okay, so why does that relate to health? When we think about the central banks being private entities and private companies, it is either those organizations and groups that know each other directly. It's a small group at the top, and these guys are either directly the same groups that own pharmaceutical companies, or they're very tightly related to the groups that own pharmaceutical companies. And as one of the directors of the central bank quite a while back in America said, when he was questioned about the role of the central bank and how they worked with the president in charge, and I'm paraphrasing heavily here, but essentially he said the president is irrelevant because we control what the president does. And this is in America. That was in either the 80s or 90s, I can't quite remember. And again, we've got families like the Rockefeller families and the Rothschilds families who blatantly just describe that whoever controls the money controls the direction of the world, regardless of who is voted into power. So if we're working from the premise that these same entities control the pharmaceutical companies, I get asked this question quite a lot about why we would have this kind of global consensus with a pandemic. And what we can see is we can see that there is some absolutely disastrous anti-health information that all these governments all around the world appear to be adopting. And a good example of that is the lockdowns, for example. So um, to kind of take it in a health direction, vitamin D is probably the most important uh, little substance. It's actually a hormone as well as a vitamin in our bodies, and it's responsible for just about everything. It's responsible for making our neurotransmitters, the ones that are responsible for our the chemicals that keep us happy. And the sunlight hits our skin. Our skin has got cholesterol in it, and the cholesterol breaks down when the sun hits it. And then we have the release of vitamin D, which is held in the cholesterol, which distributes to our body and keeps us well. So staying indoors is one of the most anti-health messages that I have ever heard of. And to have this kind of ruthlessly enforced by all these different countries around the world, to me is insanity. It just goes against every kind of tenet of being healthy in any way, shape, or form. Another example of a very anti-health and anti-life policy is this policy of masks. And when we think of the size of viral particles, which are about zero point zero 0.04 nanometers, I mean, that is just it's on a scale it's so small it's unimaginable. The size of the holes in masks are anything from 10 to 60 to 80 times bigger than the size of viral particles. So the analogy that lots of people use is the analogy of mosquitoes going through a chain link fence. They're just as effective as that for viruses. Notwithstanding the fact that as I've described before, you have this moist environment in front of your face, which acts like a petri dish, which essentially means that you're harboring a lovely environment for bacteria to grow in, and then you're breathing that stuff in. Nature made us very clever, and one of the things that we have to do is we have to expel the air that's in front of our faces. So just trapping all this stuff is crazy, absolutely crazy. We have marginally higher levels of carbon dioxide when we're breathing this air in front of our faces. And again, people don't realize these kind of very simple basics, but carbon dioxide in water forms a thing called carbonic acid. So a slightly higher level of carbon dioxide means that our blood is slightly more acidic, and a slightly more acidic environment leads to cancers like slightly more acidic environments. And because the electrical charge of acidity is quite different, one of the things our bodies tries to do to balance out that charge is calcium is a thing that counteracts that electrical charge. So we end up leaching calcium from our bones, and if you're older and if you have any kind of osteo problems, essentially you're demineralizing your bones and you're making them weaker as well. So that these anti-health narratives are absolutely astonishing. Is about the only word I can use to describe them. And again, there's no scientific evidence to say that masks have ever helped in reducing the spread of a virus. We've got this subjective kind of correlation that they stop airflow, and then people are assuming that the air being stopped means that viral particles in the air are actually being limited. And there is nothing directly to substantiate that fact that that correlation is accurate. There's no scientific papers telling us that this is actually what's happening. People are just making assumptions. So it's very important to realize that. Where am I going with all this? To connect all these dots up together. If we have this concept that booms and busts are built into the economic cycle, the last big crash we had was the housing crisis, and the bankers got blamed. Now, if we assume that busts are actually built into the cycle of the financial system, we can assume that another bust is built into it. So another massive crash is planned. If we are going to blame if we're going to blame bankers or the economic institutions for it, that's not so good. But all of a sudden, if we can blame an invisible enemy called um, a particular type of virus, which everybody's talking about, And it's even crazy that I got to censor myself to say the word for the thought that this video will be taken down. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, you can guess what virus I'm talking about. So if we can blame an invisible enemy or a virus for crashing the economy, then the people who engineer this stuff, there is no spotlight that's shined on them. And if we also assume that these people essentially own the medical industry, and the medical industry wants to supply us with an antidote, for want of a better word, in the form of a jab. If we create an industry where the whole population of the world, 7.9 billion people, have to receive a form of medication 2 or 3 times a year, every year, all of a sudden, out of nothing, let's rephrase that. There has been created the biggest industry the world has ever seen, which will actually be bigger than the petrochemical industry. So there's plenty of reasons why. There is collusion in relation to pushing the idea of a pandemic upon the world. And if we think about who essentially kind of controls our governments, we'll use America as an example again. So we have this phenomena in America called lobbying. And lobbying essentially is bribing government officials. And if you have people in power whose campaign was funded by pharmaceutical industries, then you can be assured that these guys have a debt to the people who sponsored them, and they are going to look favorably on changing legislation to maybe pass laws which are not in the best interests of public health. And we've seen this time and time again. I could go into detail about some particular laws that have been passed that have compromised health dramatically in America. There's a law, if you want to look at it, it's called the Bayh-Dole Act, and that happened, I think, in the 80s in America. You've got legislation which has been passed to indemnify huge medical companies from being sued if they harm patients. The list kind of goes on and on. So I guess to kind of wrap up, we have what I'm suggesting is that health professionals need to have a little bit more skepticism about the information that is being given to them by people from authority. And if they work from a position of more skepticism, they are probably going to meet the values of their profession a little bit more accurately. And for example, in medicine, one of the first kind of oaths that you swear on is a thing called the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. So if you're making decisions for patients that are not fully informed, and again, when I say fully informed, I mean knowing about the history of how the medical system was organized and knowing a little bit about the financial structure, then you're making a more formed decision, and then you can make decisions that are not going to be adversely affecting your patients. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense, and feel free to comment and ask me some more stuff, and I'm happy to elaborate, because I'm only actually touching the tip of the iceberg with how important that information is, and the repercussions of how it affects people in general. Also, again, I'll just a bit of a plug here. So I'm kind of stepping away from mainstream, working in the mainstream medical system. So I'm running courses to kind of explain this and to give people alternatives for health that doesn't involve medication, that's based on principles that doctors really don't tell you about. So if you want to know about some of those, please just message me in the comments. I've got a few quite reasonably priced programs which are fully refundable if people don't like them. And again, it's important for me to, I think, be delivering as much valuable information and accurate information to help people as possible. But obviously I need to kind of put food on the table to be able to continue to do that. For anybody who watches this, thank you very much. Please like, subscribe, you know the score. And if you hit me up, I'll put some links to some of these kind of things I've talked about as well in comments if people